October 1st, 1991. Richard Petty announces that he will retire at the end of the 1992 Winston Cup season. Many fans expected Richard to retire in 1991 due to the poor performance he was having. But Richard didn't feel right about doing that. He wanted to give something back to the fans who have supported him throughout his racing career, which is why Richard called his farewell season the Fan Appreciation Tour. In a season full of ups and downs, with mixed emotions, Richard looked to make the best of his final season. Racing Champions would release a special line of 1/64 scale diecast to commemorate every race Richard ran in '92. He would receive many gifts and would also take part in several media appearances, even meeting a special someone. And prior to the start of every race this year, Richard would lead during the pace laps for a ceremonial parade lap. So let's dive in to part 5 of the final years of Richard Petty's career, 1992, the Fan Appreciation Tour. 1992 began as always with speed weeks. Richard qualified 9th for his final Daytona 500 and would line up 5th in the first Gatorade Twin 125. But on lap 4, Richard would get caught up in a multi-car incident coming off of turn 4. Richard brought the STP Pontiac behind the wall and DNF'd in 23rd, relegating him to a 32nd place starting position for his final Daytona 500. The Daytona 500 came around, and as Richard was introduced during driver introductions, he received a standing ovation from the fans. As the field was on pit road, waiting to get the command to fire engines, Bill France Jr. did something a little unusual prior to giving the command.
Standing by, the president of NASCAR, Bill
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Will the gentleman representing the Kingdom of Random in North Carolina please start his engine?
With the STP Pontiac pushed to the front of the field on pit road, Richard cranked up his car, and since he was the Grand Marshal, Richard put his own twist on the command.
Okay guys, let's go. Crank them up.
The field rolled off pit road for their pace laps, and as he would for the remainder of the season, Richard would lead the first pace lap before settling back into his qualifying position, which is 32nd. Richard quickly moved up through the field and would climb as high as 19th when shortly before halfway on lap 93, going down the backstretch, pole sitter Sterling Marlin and defending winner Ernie Irvan, along with Bill Elliott, made contact and set off a massive 13-car wreck, and Richard would get hit trying to avoid it and would spin into the infield. Richard sustained minimal damage to the hood and front end of his Pontiac. Richard would go on to finish 16th, 2 laps down in his 32nd and final Daytona 500 start. Rockingham was next on the schedule. Richard would start in 29th and finish a solid 16th, 5 laps down. Richard's son Kyle, however, won the pole for the race and would lead 24 laps before falling out with camshaft issues. Richard was now sitting 11th in points, the highest he would be in the standings all season. Race 3 at Richmond, Richard qualified in 25th, and with his wife Linda giving the command, Richard was running on the lead lap, but would get caught up on pit road during green flag pit stops when the caution came out. The pace car eventually lapped Richard, and Richard was unable to make up the lost ground, leaving him in 21st, 6 laps down. At Atlanta, Richard had another solid run. He started in 32nd and would get as high as 13th, before going on to finish in 16th, 1 lap down. The next week at Darlington, ESPN would cover their first race of the season. During most of their broadcasts for the season, ESPN would provide fans with special Richard Petty memories to commemorate Richard's final season. The Richard Petty memory shown for this race was a callback to Richard's devastating crash in the 1970 Rebel 400.
That was one of the worst wrecks I had. We had run into the wall about 8 or 10 laps before that, down in 1 and 2. Then I kept trying to run the car, and when we trying to get it back up to speed, finally got to running pretty good again, then running the wall coming off at 4. And when it did, it broke the steer, and the car come down to the inside, turned over 4 or 5 times, and my arm kept coming out the window.
Richard would start the Trans-South 500 in 30th, and would be handed his first DNF of the season when his engine went sour early in the race, leaving him in 32nd. After qualifying 14th at Bristol, Richard was able to stay in touch with the leaders until on lap 15, the 22 of Sterling Marlin drifted up the track in turn 2 and hit the wall. Marlin came back down, leaving Richard with no place to go, and Richard ran right into the back of Marlin, causing serious front-end damage to the STP Pontiac. The crew repaired the car enough for Richard to get back on track, and Richard went on to finish in 27th, 146 laps down. ESPN covered the event, and the Richard Petty memory that was shown was Richard's Bristol sweep in 1975. At North Wilkesboro, Richard qualified in 28th. ESPN was covering their third race in a row, and the Petty memory for the first Union 400 was a callback to Richard's 15 wins at North Wilkesboro. On lap 7, Richard would get caught up in a wreck in turn 4. Petty brought the STP Pontiac into the garage for repairs and would return to the track before falling out due to handling issues, leaving him 31st, his second DNF of the season, dropping him to 25th in the Winston Cup standings. Martinsville wouldn't be much better for the King. Richard started in 29th, and on lap 2 would spin in turn 3. Richard would gather it back up, but would fall out due to engine issues, leaving him 29th. ESPN's Petty memory for this race was a throwback to Richard's 15 Martinsville wins and his Martinsville rivalry with Bobby Allison. Richard was handed his third DNF of the season and would drop one more spot in points to 26th. Talladega was next on the schedule. ESPN's Petty memory was the 1973 Daytona 500, Richard's fourth Daytona 500 win, and his first 500 win with STP on the hood. Richard qualified 17th for the Winston 500 and would go on to finish in 15th, his new season best finish and first lead lap finish of the season. After Talladega, the Winston Cup Series would make their way back to Charlotte to prepare for the Winston and the Coca-Cola 600. Prior to the Winston, a special 30-lap Legends race consisting of some of NASCAR's greats took place on the track's quarter-mile infield track. Dick Brooks won the pole, and Elmo Langley would win over Cale Yarborough and Paul Goldsmith. Richard, along with Terry Labonte, did not have to compete in the Winston Open due to being the most recent past champions not locked into the field. One driver in the field making his debut in the Winston was Dave Mader III. Mader was locked in due to driving a car that had won the previous year. Mader was driving the 9 car from Melling Racing, which won one race in 1991 with Bill Elliott. The 1992 Winston was dubbed One Hot Night because it was the first superspeedway race to be held under the lights. Richard started in 15th. As the field was preparing to begin the second segment, the fans elected that the field be inverted from how they finished in segment 1. Richard started third in the second segment and almost immediately moved to second and was challenging Jeffrey Bodine for the lead. Richard could not get around Bodine and would go on to finish his final Winston in 9th. Richard's son Kyle was caught up in a last lap incident while battling for the lead. Going into turn 3 on the final lap, leader Dale Earnhardt got loose and spun, and Kyle had to check up to avoid hitting Earnhardt. This allowed Davey Allison to get a run on Petty, and the two of them came to the line side by side, and Petty made contact with Allison's right rear and sent the 28 crashing hard into the outside wall. Kyle would go on to finish in second, and Allison would have to celebrate his win from the hospital with a broken collarbone. Richard then qualified 12th for the Coca-Cola 600. On lap 15, Richard had climbed to 8th, and when going into turn 4, he got into the marbles and slid up the track and hit the wall with the right side. Richard came onto pit road to get some repairs done to the STP Pontiac, and the crew began applying duct tape to the damage on the right rear. But as Richard pulled out of his stall, a crew member forgot to tear off the roll, and Richard left the pits with a roll of duct tape stuck to his right rear. Later, on lap 111, Alan Kulwicki spun off turn 4, and the field was checking up to avoid hitting the 7 car. Richard, his car having braking problems, nearly slammed into the back of a slowing car, trying to avoid Kulwicki, and Richard himself would spin out. Then finally, one lap later, after the restart, Richard would get caught up in a wreck in Turn 1 with Mark Martin, Derek Hope, and Hutch Strickland. Richard would finish in 42nd and would be handed his 4th DNF of the season, dropping him to 28th in the standings. Richard qualified 17th at Dover, and despite the inclement weather, he would finish in 20th, 11 laps down. At Sears Point, during the pace laps, it was announced that the founder of NASCAR, Bill France Sr., had passed away at the age of 82. Richard qualified in 30th and quickly began moving up, and despite spinning in turn 11 on lap 38, Richard would go on to finish in 21st, his second lead lap finish of the season. At Pocono, Richard would finish in 16th, 2 laps down. ESPN's petty memory of the race was a throwback to Richard's 100th career win at Bowman Gray Stadium in 1969. This race would turn out to be the 5th and final win for Alan Kulwicki. Richard would have another strong run the next week at Michigan, where he would finish in 15th, 2 laps down. July 2nd, 1992, the day of Richard's 55th birthday, as well as qualifying for the Pepsi 400. Richard was preparing to make his 74th and final start at Daytona. Richard had won at Daytona 11 times, 7 times in the Daytona 500, and 3 times in the Pepsi 400, and once in the Twin 125s. Richard was looking to make the best of his final Daytona start, and he would do just that in qualifying. Richard would put his STP Pontiac on the pole with a lap speed of 188.961 miles an hour, and for nearly an hour, Richard stayed on top as other drivers attempted to bump the 43 off the top, and it looked as if Richard was going to win the pole. But unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be, as Sterling Marlin would take over the top spot and would move Richard down to the second place starting position. It was Richard's first front row start since North Wilkesboro in 1986. The race would also have a special guest as the Grand Marshal, President George H.W. Bush. To honor Richard's final Daytona start, a special ceremony was held on the infield, and President Bush would give a speech in Richard's honor.
And I just met with the NASCAR drivers, a real thrill for a sports fan, and they epitomize the best in sportsmanship, the best in family, the best in patriotic values. And so today, on the 4th of July, this president comes not only to greet the American people and the fans here, but this president comes to greet a king, Richard Petty, one of the great Americans. Richard, I'm proud to be at your side.
President Bush would give the command and would also ride shotgun in the pace car. The field took the green flag, and Richard immediately jumped out to the lead. The field came off turn 4 to complete the first lap. Petty and Marlin were side by side, and as the crowd erupted into cheers, Petty would inch ahead of Marlin to lead the first lap. Richard went on to lead the first 5 laps. These would be the final laps Richard Petty would lead in his legendary career. ESPN's petty memories of the race were throwbacks to Richard's 7 wins in the Daytona 500. On lap 82, Richard had already fallen back in the field and would pull onto pit road and would climb out of the car after falling victim to heat-related fatigue. The crew frantically prepared for Eddie Bierschwell to take the 43 back on track and bring it to finish, but Bierschwell would only last a few laps before bringing the 43 behind the wall. Bierschwell would give the 43 a 36th place finish, and this would be Richard's 5th DNF of the season. The next week, Richard had another great qualifying run. Qualifying 7th for his final race at Pocono, Richard had a solid run, finishing in 20th, 1 lap down. The petty memory of this race was a throwback to Richard's first win with STP in 1972. This race is most remembered for Davey Allison's terrifying flip on lap 160. Allison was severely injured in this wreck, suffering from a broken right forearm, a dislocated wrist, and a concussion, but this wouldn't stop him from competing next week at Talladega. At Talladega, Richard, yet again, had a great qualifying run. Richard qualified 4th for his final Talladega race, and would finish in 15th, 1 lap down. Race 18 was at Watkins Glen. This was the first Winston Cup race at Watkins Glen to use the new bus stop chicane in the wake of J.D. McDuffie's fatal accident the year prior. Richard qualified in 18th and would spin twice, once in turn 1 and a second time in turn 11. ESPN's petty memory of the race was a throwback to Riverside in 1970, which would be Richard's first of 5 wins at Riverside. Richard would finish in 28th, 1 lap down after the race was called for rain, and his son Kyle would win the rain-shortened event. Richard qualified 21st for his final trip to Michigan. ESPN's petty memory of the race was a throwback to Father's Day of 1986 at Michigan, when Richard's daughters Sharon, Lisa, and Rebecca gave the command to start engines to commemorate Richard's 1,000th start at the time. Richard would have another solid run, finishing in 18th, 1 lap down. Harry Gant would get his 18th and final win and would set a new record as the oldest driver to win a Cup Series race, as well as giving Oldsmobile their final win. 4 days prior, however, tragedy struck as Davey Allison's younger brother Clifford was killed in the Busch Series practice crash for the Detroit Gasket 300. Clifford Allison was only 27 years old. Davey would go on to race in his brother's memory and would go on to finish 5th at Michigan. The Bud 500 at Bristol was next on the schedule. This was the first race at Bristol after the track was resurfaced with concrete. Richard qualified in 30th. ESPN's petty moment of the race was the story of why Richard wears his famous hat and sunglasses.
My eyes are sensitive to light anyway, so I was wearing some kind of sunglasses. So I got to wearing these, and the wind, would keep the dust and stuff out from behind them. I mean, they was open, you wouldn't sweat and all that stuff. So it just got to be a more and more of a habit deal. And now the only time I take them off, I guess, when I go to bed or take a bath or something like that. It's just got to be part of it. And the hat, I think, came about a little bit later on. I think it's not been going but maybe 10 years or something like that.
Richard had a solid run and came home to finish in 16th, 7 laps down. With 9 races left in the Fan Appreciation Tour, Richard was sitting 26th in the standings. Richard started 31st for his final race at Darlington. Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, who was in the thick of his presidential campaign, was the Grand Marshal, and Richard would climb as high as 20th before the race was cut short, past halfway due to rain. Richard would finish in that position, 3 laps down, to race winner Darrell Waltrip. The petty memory for this race was a throwback to the 1979 Rebel 500 and Richard's battle with Darrell Waltrip for the win. This would turn out to be the 84th and final win for Darrell Waltrip. Richard had another solid run the next race at Richmond. He started 30th and finished in 16th, 1 lap down. Dover was a rough race for Petty. He started in 25th and by lap 210 was running in 33rd. On lap 278, Richard was taken out in a hard wreck on the backstretch with 7 other cars. Richard would DNF in 28th, his 6th and final DNF of the season. This was also the 349th and final DNF of Richard's career. At Martinsville, the race was postponed to Monday due to rain on Sunday. Richard started in 15th, and on lap 22, Dave Marcus drove in too deep into turn 1 and made contact with the 43, sending both him and Richard around. Richard would get back going and would finish in 18th, 5 laps down. ESPN's petty moment of this race was a throwback to Ontario in 1972, when Richard completed his 100,000th mile. North Wilkesboro was next, and just like Martinsville last week, the race was postponed to Monday due to rain on Sunday. The race ran caution-free, and Richard would finish in 27th, 10 laps down, after starting in 21st. ESPN's petty memory of this race was a throwback to the year prior, when Richard announced that 1992 would be his final year as a driver, calling it his Fan Appreciation Tour. Prior to the start of Richard's final race at Charlotte, Humpy Wheeler presented Richard with a performance of Auld Lang Syne by Diamond Rio. Richard started 32nd and would finish 11 laps down in 27th. Rockingham wouldn't be much better, as Richard qualified in 26th and finished in 25th, 10 laps down. His son Kyle, however, would go on to dominate the race, leading all but 8 laps en route to the victory. Prior to the race at Rockingham, 30 of the Winston Cup teams competed in a pit crew challenge. The 43, unfortunately, would finish in last after receiving a 6-second penalty. The Pyro 500 at Phoenix was the second to last race of the season. Richard would be the Grand Marshal for the Pyro 500.
Gentlemen, start your engine.
Richard qualified in 24th and finished in 22nd, 3 laps down. We now come to the final race of the 1992 season, the Hooters 500 at Atlanta, and the final race of the Fan Appreciation Tour. It was an emotional and hectic weekend for Richard, his family, his team, and his fans. The night before qualifying, Richard's cousin and longtime crew chief Dale Inman was robbed at gunpoint in the parking lot of his hotel with his wife and his daughter. The thief tried to fire a gun at Inman, but it jammed, causing the thief to run, and Inman gave chase on foot. The thief got away in a getaway car, and Inman grabbed onto it, but the car took off so fast that Inman had to let go. Dale and his family were not hurt. Richard was barely even able to qualify for the Hooters 500. He wasn't even eligible for provisional and had to qualify on time. Richard did manage to qualify, but did so in 39th. Ceremonies to honor Richard were planned for pre-race and post-race. The night before the race, the country band Alabama held a concert honoring Richard at the Georgia Dome. 45,000 fans were in attendance. We now come to the race itself, November 15th, 1992. With 162,500 fans in attendance, there were many storylines heading into this race. A championship battle for the ages, and Jeff Gordon would make his Winston Cup debut, while Richard Petty would make his final start. The cars were lined up on pit road, and just like every race this season, Richard's car was moved to its ceremonial position at the front of the field. And prior to the command, the cameras were pointed to Richard's daughters, Sharon, Rebecca, and Lisa, and son Kyle. They all gave the command together for Richard to start his engine before the rest of the field started theirs.
Eddie, start your engine.
The field rolled off pit road to start their pace laps, and with Apache helicopters flying overhead, Richard would lead the first pace lap, as he did all season long, before falling back to his qualifying position in 39th. Richard was able to avoid the carnage on lap 2 after Rick Mast and Brett Bodine wrecked, and by lap 40, Dale Earnhardt put Richard a lap down. ESPN's final Petty memory of the race would be a throwback to when Richard won his 7th championship in 1979. Richard's car was not fast enough to contend for a win, but all Richard wanted to do was finish the race. However, on lap 95, that all went up in fire and smoke. Going down the front stretch, a multi-car pileup would occur after Dick Trickle and Ken Schrader got together. As more cars became collected in the crash, others were checking up to avoid it, including Richard. Richard would run into the back of the 45 of Rich Bickle, severely damaging the front end of the STP Pontiac and breaking his oil cooler, triggering a fire. Richard brought his car to the inside of turn 1 and pulled up to the fire truck, and just as ESPN switched to Richard's in-car camera, they heard Richard say this.
Petty has got the car stopped. Give her in the fucking fire. It'll go out. Fire extinguisher.
The fire was extinguished, and Richard climbed out unhurt, and as he climbed out, he waved to the fans before heading back to the garage area. The race went back green, and the Petty Enterprises crew went to work to fix the STP Pontiac to get Richard back on track. With about 24 laps to go, Richard climbed back into the STP Pontiac as ESPN switched to his in-car camera, and the crew were making final adjustments to get Richard back on the track. With 2 laps to go, Richard pulled onto pit road and was back on track, his car having no front sheet metal, and as Bill Elliott came around to take the checkered flag, Richard was right there, crossing the line, completing the 307,836th lap, and final lap of his legendary career. Bill Elliott won the race, Alan Kulwicki won the championship, and after Alan Kulwicki completed his famous Polish victory lap, Richard pulled back onto the track, and with the song Richard Petty Fans by Alabama playing on the track's loudspeakers, Richard took one final lap to salute the fans who have supported him through his NASCAR career before pulling back onto pit road and gave his final interview as a driver.
It's been wonderful. I mean, 35 years, the good Lord's looked after us all these years. And I'm still walking around. I hate to got in a wreck and disappointed me and some of the fans, but the big deal is we're here talking to you when it's over with, and I wouldn't change none of it. I wouldn't trade nothing for nothing else.
On December 11th, Richard and his wife Linda were at the White House, where Richard would receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush. Richard is the only race car driver to receive this award. The Fan Appreciation Tour was a success and would set the stage for future NASCAR retirement tours. This may have been Richard's final race as a driver, but it wouldn't be his final race overall. Richard returned in 1993, this time as just a car owner. Rick Wilson would drive for him, but in the number 44, not the 43. Also, in 1993, during a tire test for the inaugural Brickyard 400 for 1994, Richard brought back the 43 and turned some laps before donating the car to the IMS Museum. In 1996, with Bobby Hamilton driving the 43, Hamilton would score his first career win at Phoenix, which was also Petty Enterprises' first win since 1983 and the first for the 43 since 1984. Hamilton would also win again at Rockingham in 1997. In 1998, Richard's grandson Adam was climbing through the ranks, and in his very first ARCA start at Charlotte, Adam would roll into victory lane. In 1999, Petty Enterprises celebrated their 50th anniversary, and at Martinsville in April, Petty Enterprises would sweep the weekend, with Jimmy Hensley winning the Truck Series race and John Andretti winning the Cup race. These wins would later prove to be the final wins for Petty Enterprises' Cup and Truck Series teams. 2000 was an emotional year for Richard Petty and Petty Enterprises. The longtime sponsor STP announced they would be leaving Petty Enterprises, soon to be replaced by General Mills. Grandson Adam would make his Cup debut at Texas, but would blow his engine and would DNF in 40th. 3 days after Adam's debut, Richard's father Lee would pass away at the age of 86, and just 5 weeks later, Adam was killed in the Busch Series practice crash at New Hampshire. He was only 19 years old. For 2001, Petty Enterprises switched manufacturers. After racing Pontiacs since 1983, the Pettys made the switch to Dodge, as the manufacturer made its return to the sport. In 2006, Richard would be a part of the cast of the Disney Pixar movie Cars, voicing the character Strip Weathers, who in the movie is also called the King.
Hey, buddy, you're one gutsy racer. You got more talent in one lug nut than a lot of cars has got in their whole body.
Really? Oh,
But you're stupid.
Excuse me?
Richard would reprise the role in Cars 3 in 2017. In 2007, Chad McCumbee would score Petty Enterprises their final win as a team after winning the 2007 Pocono 200 in ARCA. In 2008, Petty Enterprises had difficulty securing sponsorship for the 43 and the 45, and Kyle Petty would make his final start as a driver in the second-to-last race of the season at Phoenix. As of 2023, Richard is still heavily involved in NASCAR at 85 years young, and is still very popular among his fans. Although his final 5 seasons as a driver weren't his best, it was still nice to go over those final seasons and see how it played out for Richard. From the ups and downs, Richard was able to still do what he loved, and even came close to scoring win 201 on several occasions. And although he did not win another race, he was able to retire on his own terms and went out in a blaze of glory. No pun intended. Some fans will say Richard is the best driver in NASCAR history, and others will argue that statement and say other drivers were better. From his driving style to his 200 wins, his 7 Daytona 500s, and his championships, and the respectful way he treats his fans, it's no wonder why Richard is so popular, even to this day. But one thing is for sure, there will never be another driver like Richard Petty, and he will always be the one and only king of NASCAR.